All right. So here we are, just the three of us. Do 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 do.
Four, if you look at the screen the way we see it.
I suppose so. Yeah. Well, that's
Somebody's head.
everybody can see that too. Just the four of us. So Portal Mountain Development Meeting number 59. It's been a while, so it's kind of great to get back to it.
I think it's more of a jam right now than a consistent
Yeah,
meeting because
right.
we need to
Jamming is good though.
we need to circle back, as it were, and
Sure.
get on the same page
Sure.
and synergize and
Right. So it's always kind of casual, anyways.
yeah, but we did have a hot topic on the go, so
Yeah, of course. Normally we bring up what's come up on Portal Mountain lobby for the past couple weeks normally, and so we do have a couple topics. So 59 we have been going for almost like a couple years. This past year we've been focusing on a book, on developing a book, and right now we're just we can jam, but our topics are a domain.
well, jamming with a theme, not just random shit.
Of course, what we've had in mind. One is this domain-driven language related to the APS, and this is related to, in my mind at least, and from our previous talkings, like guild facilitation.
Yeah.
So like the ability to help to organize amongst yourself and organize yourself and help others to organize. You need an ability to speak the language of the APS, which is ideally supposed to be the most kind of isomorphic way of describing how people can see their environment and interact with it. You can use a language to sort of give a template of interaction and use this to organize as holons, right?
Yeah, and to get even more a little more esoteric, if you will, it's the kind of language that explains or touches on how what we call dream is constructed moment to moment and allows us to navigate the tasks of the dream, if you will, through the language of the dream itself, rather than having the dream being, so to speak, hijacked by said language, and sort of fabricating its own reality. Like the thing we call psychosis.
So we're looking for an isomorphism between you would say, the map and the territory, or the mind and the body sort of thing, like the upper and lower. We're just looking for an isomorphism across layers, that's all. So when we want to try and quote unquote organize our behavior, it has to be spoken. If we're going to be speaking it out, it has to be written and spoken in a way that's congruent with how we actually perceive our environments and our movements through them.
And it's the same idea that we've been discussing in reference to model speak. Model speak is more of a human language to describe the dream in a way that applies to their how they would qualify each moment by moment event. This is more like about how to use the utilities of the APS to see how dreams are constructed in a different way. So this is a different kind of language, but it's very much related in the same sense, like you're saying, that we must be able to speak the same way to understand each other. Essentially, is what we're saying. And I would say the difference between these two languages is the one is, I would say, more on the perceptive side, where the whole narrative...
Yeah, I was thinking we might align these to temperament-wise.
The whole narrative is spun together,
like
whereas this one is more on the pragmatic side, where you're trying to weave a protocol together. And the protocol is far more, I'd say, mechanical in its in the way it manifests itself, like an algorithm. And basically, due to that is how we arrived at this language, which has been on my mind for quite some time, but I've finally been able to get ChatGPT to help me out with it.
Mm-hmm. And I sometimes like thinking about protocols as an example. Your driver's license testing booklet that they give you with like, okay, now imagine this junction in this scenario. You're turning here, right? It's you just learn thing after thing. It's like the soundbite idea, right? And this is all pasting together a tapestry that's sort of
That you can draw on,
abstractly represents what you're actually doing when you're driving, right?
Right, because like for example, the way I would I would actually interpret this is to think about the novice driver versus the experienced driver, where the novice driver is thinks in terms of the the structure of the car. So in their minds, they're turning the steering wheel, they're pressing the gas pedal, they're shifting their gear stick, right? They're looking at their mirror. They are clicking their turn signal. Like those are things that you do to the car.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, your experienced driver is going to check his surroundings, speed up and slow down, turn left or right, and indicate that, and transmit information to other people. They're not thinking about what the car is going to do. They're not thinking, I need to turn the signal. They're thinking, I need to tell them I'm turning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're not thinking, I'm going to press the gas pedal. They're thinking, I need to speed up. So that it sounds like a really subtle detail, but it's a completely different language. Right? That they've assimilated the car into the process, and now there is no car. There is just the activity of the person that is driving it. So that's how I would think about this. So when you're saying you're taking a tapestry of things, you're taking the tapestry of doing activities to the car, but what builds up is the activity of what you are doing with the car.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that and when you switch to that next secondary built up thing, you no longer feel like a novice, and you no longer are trying to remember what the right sequence of steps is. Mm-hmm. It's automated.
Right.
It's been integrated.
Yeah, so integrated, I guess, into your existing structures of thought that you would utilize and reuse elsewhere.
Yeah.
Kind of be the codes become more generalized, and they kind of snap to that. So you can remember what you were taught to do. Oh, the turning signal does this, but it gets summarized, I guess, up.
Yeah, I think I forgot to mention the explicit bit there. I said you go from turning the steering wheel to going left. Well, the car is not the only space in which you go left. You can go left while walking, right? Mm-hmm. Like so.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
It starts to combine with different metaphors for the same thing, right? Like you're no longer thinking in terms of the mechanics of the object, but rather in a more abstract, metaphorical sense of the activity that's taking place.
And it would be much more difficult to try and unlearn that if it's snapped in, right? Things just get into the groove.
Well, you can totally see it in the formation of bad habits.
Mm-hmm.
Right, doing it the wrong way, like not from the like. I have the authority to tell you the right way, but from like it's a mechanically. It's an observably mechanically worst way to go about something. Like you can measure it, observe it, and see it. Like for example, not touching your clutch while switching a manual gear box. You can do it. You have the freedom to do it. But your car is not going to last long.
That's not true.
Well, I mean,
if you do it at the right RPM.
Right, but that's just compensation there. I'm talking. You're not doing the compensation. You're just like fucking. I don't give a shit about my.
Yeah, some people like to drive that way.
I'm not.
Actually, it'll save your clutch.
No. The people who know how to match the RPM, sure, but the people who don't and just treat it like an automatic, what are they gonna do? They're going to grind the shit out of the metal.
Correct.
That's all I'm trying to say. I'm trying to keep it simple. So,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, there's these.
Technically, you're right. Correct.
There you
kind
go.
of correct.
There you go. Speaking of correcting, I'll be corrected in a moment.
All right. And I suppose we'll take a short break.
Very short.
Mm-hmm. And we are back.
Alright, so just before we clicked on, I stated that I want to kind of paint a picture to get us started in terms of visualizing where we're starting from and where we're going with it. You know, like why,
Right.
how are we getting to where we're getting, and what's the starting point to even be there.
Agreed.
So, to get there, we're gonna start with the layer of the spectacle itself, the concrete layer.
Do we want to bring up a certain...
No, we're not gonna need it because it's not going to go beyond the abstract layer. So I'm not interested in going all that started the model. We're just kind of trying to paint a picture of the starting point, the spectacle. And the way I like to really envision it, to keep shit really, 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 really simple to visualize, is like, imagine a rubber sheet, right? It doesn't have an edge or anything like that. It's just a rubber sheet. And different sized balls are in the air. Gravity pulls them down. They bounce off the sheet and into each other, and you know what I mean? Like,
sure.
That's the scene. That's
okay.
And then you have the situation where the light shuts off and comes back on. So a shutter effect happening. So all you get is these glimpses of where the balls are in an instant, then it shuts off. The balls do their thing, you get another view. So what you're seeing is snapshots of movements.
Yep.
Right? And that goes really, really, really fast, and then combined together you get like the dream picture. This is moments weaving a dream. And we're starting right there because this is the place where we, quote unquote, think we see everything happening. That's our like concrete representation of what we think is happening.
And phenomenologically, you would observe objects.
Yes.
Right.
This is what you would see: concrete objects.
If you want to start looking into phenomenology and noticing or classifying, categorizing your experience, you're going to start with this thing. Your senses keep giving objects to you
over and over, right? and they're shifting in such a fast way, in that disappearance factor is smoothed out over time, right? Like you don't catch on that there's like this behind the scenes bouncing
things going on,
and then everything's reassembled again. So you don't, yeah.
Well, yeah, because the moment of cognition, it doesn't matter if it takes 1,000,000 years to get to the next moment. It's still gonna feel like it just happened.
Yeah, and the other feature of what we're talking about is like it makes these moments seem very, very static, like infinitely frozen in space. Right, like between each shutter, that flash of thing, that's it. That's how it is. There's no other it. There's just that. So that's the other feature of this scenario. So this is, again, just to keep things simple as to like the method by which this information is coming into the other senses, right? So all of this sends off signals in the entire neurological structure. Those signals reassemble back into artifacts, giving us a memeplex, and come back out as things. And this is now where we are with the abstract space. However, all of these things that have appeared in the spectacle are to be categorized, divided, right? And now
this is the abstract to the concrete. If you want to step back and
we got the concrete situation, and now we want to go abstract and say, of all these balls that I'm seeing in each of these moments, how do I think about them? How do I categorize this versus that versus this? Because some of those balls are abstractions, some of those balls are concrete things like stones being thrown. Some of those things are abstractions, like the location it'll land.
So now you're talking about the types of objects that can
exactly
exist.
Now we're getting into the decisions that we've made with regard to how to do that. Types of objects, the first kind of categorization layer, the simple one.
Oops, I forgot to share the link. It's just getting juicy, so we better.
Yeah. Since nobody knows we're here, nobody can hear the snap.
Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, like, exactly as you're saying, there's like now this need to say this object is, say, more dangerous than that object, or this is hot, this is cold, this is white, this is black, this is this smells like shit, this smells like flowers. Like all of these different categorizations. So now you're starting to like look into the idea of subdividing objects by their type, categorizing them that way. But there's more to it, because what you'll find is that the type of an object is now not consistent across moments either. A table could be a surface for objects, could be a surface for sitting, or
Right.
it could be a source of firewood.
So this idea of entity you're bringing up for
starts
that, right?
starts to shift.
And that feels like entity is binding to matter, like it's meant to be sort of bound to some sort of vague chunk of matter.
Okay, well,
Is that
I
true,
can.
or
I know I'm gonna throw you a curveball right away.
I don't know anything about it.
In
so-
one subject, a type could be an entity, but in a different subject, a type could be a value or a service. Do you remember those other words we used? So
Right.
there you go again. There's like all of these manifestations of the same thing occurring in different ways depending on the context you're looking at it from. So this is the second layer behind the categorization. It's not just a static set of categories that we're looking at for the objects, but we're saying that there has to be a context and potentially a combination of context that really define how to categorize said objects. So contextualization, and not just simple, but very just as involved as typing and subtyping and all of that kind of stuff. Just as complicated as the type theory.
Okay, so anyways, what we were talking about is that I guess these types in the APS themselves can be sort of recycled in a way that they get viewed through a different lens and become a different sort of type, and you can just jump around and use it wherever you want. Is that what you'd call an entity, though, or why did I get that idea? Is that completely unrelated?
You can call something an entity in that moment, but it doesn't have to be an entity in the next moment.
Yeah.
That's what makes it complicated.
What is an entity? I don't even know what an entity is.
An entity is something that in a context can change its behavior over time without changing its identity and how it's being referenced within that context.
Right.
The number 5, for example, does not sound like an entity, but an entity referencing number 5 to everyone, but referencing number 6 at some point at another time is. Like, say I am 5 years old versus 6 years old in the future. The I part of it didn't change, but the age part of it did. But 5, the age 5 itself, doesn't change. Doesn't matter who's 5. So if you're 5, it's still that same 5. So. So your ID number in the system makes you an entity to that system. Because your circumstances will change and shift, and your behaviors will change and shift, but as far as it's concerned, your license number, blah, 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 blah. And the only thing it can say is whether or not this is a valid license number or not, based on some expiry date or something else. But it's going to be that same number.
Blah, 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 blah.
The point isn't to get into the weeds of this. On the whole, you'll see entities being like the major players that live through time.
So let's
where
continue
where values are going to be the things that drive them at the time.
Sure.
That's the only distinction.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you have.
So I think we just have to carry on.
And then you have something like a more encompassing entity, kind of like how the skin of your body encompasses the rest of your organs, kind of thing, that creates a boundary between the inner entities and the outer entities that communicate. Right? So you have these groupings into aggregations. Right? So an aggregate is just an entity that hides away the way it deals with the entities internal to itself.
So let's try and get back on the story that you're constructing about going into the abstract. So phenomenologically, from viewing objects and then noticing all those different types of objects.
Yeah.
That going into the abstract. Where
So
were
that
we going?
goes into that's the
from
first
there?
step of the abstract. The second step is to notice that those types are not static. So like one definition of how you categorize those objects is only really relevant to the moment in which they were categorized. This expands into a second level of categorization by subject.
Mm-hmm.
So your categorization by type appears through a particular subject. Now, subjects are a tricky business because subjects can or cannot be active at any given moment. And it is the composition of subjects together that constitute the final types decided upon at the end. So you got to go through all the relevant subjects to understand how you've categorized the types for this moment.
Now,
And this could shift.
In this drawing, you drew it more like, kind of like a single mountain peak. But I
Yes.
was wondering, like,
This should be.
is it more like a mountain range?
Yes.
Of just different things
That
that
is
to be
that is
considered?
how I hoped it would be understood, but it's like look at the space I have to work with. So it was a choice to just
the
leave
infinite
it.
media of the image format.
Yeah, it was a choice to leave it up to the imagination. But yes, you absolutely need to see this as a bunch of peaks, and some circles will encompass 2 peaks or 3 peaks at the same time, while others are only going to be in one of the
Right.
concentrations, and some of them to 2. It's just like what you see happening with the guild model, where the dots are encircled randomly by different guilds. Same. This is the same structure you need to imagine. Some subjects being in parallel, for example, will affect what a method does just by being active. And then it will depend on which subject is encompassing which other subject. So if you switch them around, you will get different preferences for how the calculation will go.
Right.
It's
right,
very
right.
volatile, very extremely volatile.
But so is existing in an
But
environment.
but it's a trick. It's a trick too, because that part in the middle circle, it seems extremely stable,
Right.
despite the volatility of it changing. Each change seems like that's it. That's the description of it, and so there is a kind of a interplay between learning and what do you call it? Stagnating. Because the learning part to change with the subject takes energy, and there's a conservation
Right.
tendency to do that, to resist it.
Yeah. Well, especially when you keep getting confirmations from your environment that your model is correct through what it could be reward and punishment system.
Right, especially if it's painful to go the other route. So, to get this out of the way, this is why we started to introduce these words. Entity, one way to categorize objects. Value is a way to distinguish the behaviors of entities as they develop through time. We have then, well, really, before we get into entities and values, we're just discussing types. So to keep things more simple, they're all types. So a type of thing. So you could be so this allows us an interface between something that's more permanent versus something that's more ephemeral, like a number versus a person, because they're on the same level of categorization by type. The second part is that this simple categorization by type changes based on the active subject. So this subject could be this type in this subject, could be that type in this subject. That type could mean this in this subject, that type could mean that in this subject, so on and goes.
So to understand this categorization of stuff, you have to have a fluid like an understanding of the fluidity of even what type of an object something is. If an object is one type in one moment, it can change.
Treating it as a surface to place items on, treating it as a surface to burn for heat. Or not treating it as a surface, but treating it as a means to generate heat. Completely different subjects on the same
Yeah.
piece of. Sure, it has the same things in common by being, composed of material that is both hard and flammable. That those are properties of some underlying context that explains why it's applicable here and there. For example, there's so many different ways to rationalize the table as an object of this type or that type or another type or any other type, depending on
Right.
what part of the
And
dream
so
you're in.
it sounds like the aspect is the description of the relationship between those types in the subject. So
Yeah.
like if an aspect of the table can be chopping it up and throwing it in the fire,
Right.
an aspect can also be placing something on it.
Right. Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
So, what tells you what the aspects are for a given type of object is the subject that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can think of the subject as a way to activate a list of specific aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And it tags on to whatever type
So
descriptions it
the
has.
subject
It gave the
is-
objects.
Like this makes sense where you'd want to describe a domain in the subject charter or whatever, to just pull in all these aspects, and then you're seeing that from that perspective. I'm just imagining like as a protocol type of thing, like if you want to let's make a Portal Mountain style lobby,
Mhm.
right? Okay, you're gonna need a media, you're gonna need an administrator, you're gonna need somebody tasked to welcoming, like it's or a welcome message.
Well, that's assuming
like
like
there's different.
It's assuming a Telegram medium, but say a dashboard would
Right.
have a different set of requirements. A dashboard
Yeah.
is some more self-managing.
So you would want to get to the more generalized, just hilarious, generalized descriptions of those things,
Mm-hmm.
like having a welcome message that looks different in a Telegram medium than it does if it's an in-person subject, right? Where it's
Like,
like
yeah, it's
you
where
must
it's
vocalize the message.
You must be close enough to the person that when you're speaking, you're definitely spitting in their face.
Yeah, that always helps. Bonus points for actual droplets on target.
Sorry, I had to take it that route, but I did.
Yeah.
But yeah, so here we're starting to see there's these three keywords that really were the heart of our understanding of the APS. All those.
Right, so we're bringing forward a kind of old concept for Portal Mountain,
Right.
anyways, the model.
So what we've done is taken to the AI, as it were, and I asked it a few questions about designing a language that would be
Mhm.
able.
And we don't need to mention any proprietary names. I appreciate that, although everybody knows kind of
No,
things.
it's not. It's not connected to it.
No, I mean like what AI service was used, or this or that,
fine,
or which one's
fine.
better, and all that kind of
Yeah,
crap.
No, I don't think anybody is questioning that portion yet. There's an observable.
The
winner.
AI, we spoke with the AI gods, and proceed.
And I basically ran the idea of creating a programming language to capture protocol, basically the kind of protocol based on the same conversation we're having right now, on taking types, putting them under subjects, and weaving them together to explain something using aspects. Right, so that's the kind of language I put together using ideas I've learned from many different desperate languages
Wait,
across
say
the
that
spectrum.
again. Sorry.
So,
Weaving together aspects. What did you ask it to?
So subject-oriented programming and aspect-oriented programming were the
I remember you brought these up a while ago.
Yeah, those were the templates I have used to describe the APS back in the day.
Yeah.
So what I asked it to do is go that same route. I'm like, okay, let's use what we know about current languages, and I want to add subject-oriented and aspect-oriented to it. And then I started to massage it into a consistent syntax, and giving it a few more features like selecting methods at runtime based on their concrete types within a concrete subject all the way down here, where it doesn't know which one it would be when it's declared over here. There's like all of these different tiny little helpful features that I thought are being extremely underutilized in many languages entirely.
Yep.
My perspective is that coming together from thinking that way is that if you weave it together in a consistent, concise way, it's actually not difficult to approach, for one. But it also helps to describe the ontological categorized set of objects in front of you very flexibly in many different ways, and it can capture the same concepts across the board in very, very unique
and probably easily
flexible ways.
Transition to any other new application.
Yeah, and it has like this like by design, it has a feature of like if you don't need to use the complexity, it's hidden from you. So even though even though internally the type will need a subject and an aspect to complete it, if you just define a type with all its properties and methods right then and there, it'll do it all for you underneath the hood. So you don't have to think about it. So it's like a best of both worlds kind of simplicity on the one scale, and then you can really get under the hood on the other.
So can you write like a white paper? Just
that's what
the language.
That's what I'm trying to get the AI to do for me right now. I got a lot of features in, so we covered the main three, but types also require an ability to ask questions about them and get responses from those questions. So you, for example, in order for some aspect to activate itself, the type in question that it's being asked to activate for has to have this method. So then you can say, okay, create a query that asks if this type has this method.
To be aspectized?
Yes. Yes, and so if the query fails, the aspect simply doesn't attach itself to that object. So that way you can write an aspect that doesn't need to know what type it's going to work on. You just need to know, does this type have method X, Y, and Z?
Right.
Does it? Activate.
Like instead of a table, you could be chopping up a couch for fire.
So long as it's choppable.
It's fine.
That's the key. That's
Property
it right there.
choppable equals true.
That's it right there. That way it allows you to reason about types, not just like, do I have this one specific type that the system requires?
I need a table. I'm hungry.
It allows you to think any type that satisfies these qualities is already there. And if you give it a type that doesn't satisfy the qualities, it's going to see it at the very point of where you gave it to it, instead of at the point of trying to use the thing that doesn't exist in it. And that way it'll be like, this is your error. Where in the past, without the concept, it would have been like, your error is over here due to shit that's like over here that you need to find yourself.
This reminds me of like the kind of TypeScript type of like on an upper layer describing your concepts or whatever, and then having that kind of lock in your type structure, like secure it or whatever.
Very similar. The difference being is that TypeScript considers two types being equal as a whole when they match in attributes. So if your attribute names and types internally match, you have a matching type. This will either match two types based on their name specifically. So does this type satisfy exactly this signature?
Mm.
Or, in the case of a concept, it will be a query into the type to satisfy certain conditions. And so you can either give it direct types, or you can tell it which concept to use, which will narrow the types into a specific list. But never can you just nilly throw any type at it and just hope it doesn't fail because something doesn't exist in it down the line. So it really constrains that situation to
Yeah, that's good.
to making sure that you're using your types correctly. That's something I lifted straight out of C++, so it's bound to be a decent construct.
Nice.
So yeah, that's a more complicated, convoluted concept that doesn't really appear as relevant to the runnings of the narrative, but it certainly plays a role when it comes to how types are
So
managed.
we've been talking. We've had this image up here, and this is kind of like our big chart, as we call it, the go-to for understanding the dream, how it's created, how what we believe as existing reality, what it's constructed out of, what are its pieces, what is the process.
So we're starting with flashes of those balls, and then we're weaving together meaning to the situation in which we find those balls arranged in. Right?
And
again, I'm just trying to keep a really simple picture just so it makes sense.
I want to just explore the connection a little bit with this programming language, because now whereas here we're talking about, like, we would say just model. This is the model of of what's what, and now you're talking about a language for programming stuff.
Right. So the way this translates, the way you can talk about dream, is that when trying to lay out components of the dream to see how that dream runs through time, you'll start with seeing what types you have. You'll then create the observed subjects that are relevant. Right now, when you're creating,
utilizing this programming language. Right?
Yes, to isolate bits and pieces of it as types, as subjects, as aspects. This is what types we find in this scenario.
So this is how to proceed with the language.
Yes. So you see what your types are. You then go ahead and determine what subjects would be relevant. So when said subject activates, what should happen? For example, it should define these methods on this type.
Yeah, I get
through these aspects.
That's going too far ahead, I think.
So this is, well, no, I'm just giving you a rundown of how this works.
But then I'm gonna forget my train of thought because I'm trying to connect. Like, how does this go to programming? Like,
well, that's what I'm trying to explain. So I don't think you'll lose your train of thought if you let me finish how it gets there. So you need to think of a scenario, right? In the scenario,
I just wanted to add that you often make programs that are supposed to be reflective of reality. Like, let's say you're programming like FedEx shipping tracking stuff, right? Like, things appear here and there.
Let's use a simple
You're
simulation.
having a system that you want to sort of emulate.
So you have people.
Like, this has always been the case, hasn't it? That's what I'm saying, I guess.
For example, if you have a situation in, like, this FedEx office, you have a bunch of people with different roles. Pretend each role is defined by a subject. A subject takes a person and says, okay, a person under this subject can do X, Y, and Z. It defines that X, Y, and Z inside an aspect called A.
These may be like the different responsibilities.
Then it can have another responsibility, B, which has tasks KLM. So, under that subject, the person in question will be able to perform KLM XYZ. As soon as that subject goes away, the same person no longer has access to those functions. So the subject's responsibility is to describe what it will open up to the type in terms of abilities. And then later down in the program, you will use that subject to say, okay, we're stepping into a situation where these roles need to be now available. So if you, so for example, if you don't have permissions to do those things, you can't activate the subject, you try to call the method, fail.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like it blocks the ability.
Yeah, I got you. So, and we're talking about organization of people here and the ability to just identify the different roles that are going on, starting with like identifying the different types of objects that you're seeing in the environment and how their aspects, how they're relating.
If person A is allowed to touch it and person B is not, then person A is always functioning under this active subject, whereas that is functioning under a different one, even though in type-wise they're both people. And this is what subjects do. So this language allows you to create your types.
Well, they're always people, but now they are administrator or
delivery, but that wasn't my point.
Delivery driver.
Yeah, but that wasn't my point. It was strictly that. What my point is that now you can have this in this language you can define what a subject will bring to the table, so that later in the flow of the code of the protocol itself, you can say this has to happen under this subject. Right? That's what it will give us as a result, like this limit constraining context.
Right.
But if you activate the very same subject elsewhere, it's not going to stop that elsewhere from functioning the same way. So you have the flexibility of just using it where you need it.
All right.
That's the gist of what subjects are for. So you define a subject and then you activate them as needed, and you nest activations. Like the definition of a subject does not know anything about how it's going to be nested as an active subject, right? Like it doesn't know.
Pardon.
It doesn't know it's not going to have another subject override itself on something.
Mm-hmm.
And it can happen in some situations, but not in others.
So, it's too bad you ran out of your limit on the AI god for the next 2 hours.
No, it's okay. We have enough to play with, so it's okay. Subjects, I think, are the most difficult thing to grasp. Aspects are easier because all they do is they complete your class definition. So if you know how to do types, all you need to think of is it's like a type definition that's not connected to anything until you tell it to be connected to something.
These details, I appreciate it, and probably people listening later on may get it, more programming types.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not always following, and sometimes I have my own trains of thoughts, which I need to kind of...
That's fine, as long as we keep in mind that this language restricts of how we should think about the APS and what is pops up in it and what doesn't.
Great.
So far, the only thing that pops up in it are the types, the concepts that deal with where types are relevant, are subjects in the definition sense and activation sense, and the aspects that those subjects connect to the types. Everything that is happening there is constrained to that language.
Yep.
Which is why it's the way to reason about how to. So if you have a space, and something needs to happen through time in that space, how do you divide this space into types, subjects, concepts, and aspects so that that running through happens naturally? Right? If you were to set it and get it going, that's what would happen. How do you? This is what we're trying to approach here. So because of the way it's divided, this is the language.
In a way that's kind of holonically congruent, as in you can make this program aware to anybody involved in that environment, and it should be able to just happen, right?
Yeah.
It's the description of what needs to be done, sort of, right? Of how it works, the inputs and the outputs through the chain.
Yes, that's the thing, and these particular grammatical constructs help us to negotiate how to treat what we've called a type in concert with what we call an aspect. So these notions give us a way to reason about, okay, if this is a type, this is an aspect, this is a subject, and the subject is activating here with this type, asking for these functions to run, what will actually happen? So we divide the space out, and then we give it a running code, the main function, if you will, of the program.
Are you talking about testing right now?
Testing is the opposite. Testing is setting up specific runs, a series of runs with expectations of how those runs would progress from point A to point B with inputs A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So what does it do in this situation? What does it do in that situation? Set the expectation of what you will need it to do so that you know it either succeeds or fails.
Yeah.
So you start with your expectation as the spec for what it's supposed to do, and then you complete the spec of how to do it, through the expectations of
With
what
these kinds of
needs to be done.
systems, you'd almost expect that you have a starting point of a system, kind of, I guess, of expected, and you'd be able to feed it potentially a wide range of values. Most of them will break it, right? But you can shove all those in, and testing seems to be about setting up limits to kind of firewall your inputs.
Yeah.
So that
to give yourself a set of known responses to all those circumstances.
Yeah, or charting out like at certain increments to see, okay, once we get past this, things are getting messed. Once we go past this, it's messed up.
Yeah.
So you can, I guess.
So you can either indicate to whoever's using this bit of code is like, you're not fulfilling your end of the contract as to how I'm supposed to be used. So if I'm telling you need to activate subject X to gain access to aspect Y, and you're activating subject A to access Y, well, I'm sorry. That's your error.
Right. Or something with specific properties that are out of spec you're trying to feed in.
Now, the method definition and all of that stuff is not as relevant to get into the details of how they're implemented and how to call them and all of that stuff, because they're just going to amount to explaining how inside a subject a type can do anything with some other type. That's all that's all that discussion is going to tell you. And under different aspects, different operations happen.
I don't know. I want to look at bigger picture, or continue connecting dots, or the more you tell me the specifics of it, when it's just kind of, it's all a soup at this point.
So
it's not helping to just add detail after detail for me.
The standard way to do this is to create a small, palatable simulation in your head and follow the different constructs as they would appear in that simulation, and it's basically running a protocol through your head. So this is why I opted for something like farm animals and shit, because you can imagine a farmhouse, you can imagine a domesticated animal and all of that crap. So if you want to,
so you're talking about seeing how it works now.
Yeah.
To try and this would be the introduction to this programming language, would be to first put a model in your head and start utilizing it.
Right. So I gave everybody aspects, concepts, types, and subjects. So we're working with with only 4 things. It's already complicated. For example, one of the things that the AI mentioned to me is that I'm missing in all of this is concurrency. What do you do when things are happening at the same time? How do you manage that kind of language? Right, so there's more. There's going to be more here than the simple picture, obviously, just to cover practical details. So, yeah.
Cool, very cool.
So yeah, like what we can do now is simply just get into a very simple scenario. I let you prompt for this what will simulate, and I'll try my best to try to iterate over how to think about each and every step of building that protocol out. So we need a starting point, we need an end point. For we have X, Y, and Z, and we need A, B, C. That's the simulation. So and I'm going to try to build the components of space. Like, so the first step will be to take the space that we're in and divide it out into the things. And the second step is to create a runner that says, you're getting this input, I need the output. Using the space we just constructed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, use that construct to run.
Okay.
So it's like, create your DNA molecule, now let it interact with the rest of the chemistry that's inside the body.
Uh-huh.
It's the two sides of code. You know this better, whether or not you like programming.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you build your functions, but then you need but then you need to start calling those functions to get anything going. Nothing
So-
changes about that.
What kind of comes to mind is just what we're doing right now, live streaming. Also, we're in the Portal Mountain lobby, you could say. So that's in one way, our environment, right? You could just describe that with this language.
I want something real simple so that it's easy to go from the main concepts to the concrete objects and back again. So I want to be like,
Mm-hmm.
see how we have those types over here, see how those subjects interplay with what happens if we try to do an activity under this subject versus that subject. So it has to be something like that would change based upon a perspective. And it could just be like one simple scenario.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One example which I don't like was from the original paper about subject-oriented programming that I read, which is pretty much the only one in existence. Was it painted the scenario of a tree, and then the two subjects were the lumberjack and the bird, and what they would value about the tree, what they would do with the tree.
It's fine. Come on, it's natural.
So yeah, so let's say we have two types of objects: bird, lumberjack.
Mm-hmm. Entry.
So actually, we have a tree, and we have two different perspectives that can be adopted by a single type of acting entity. Bear with me. We have our type, acting, and not entity from before, but like just
Okay.
just to get the concepts down. So we have a type, acting entity. We don't know how it behaves. We don't know anything about it. It's just a reference by
Mhm.
name. We then have two subjects, the two perspectives for the lumberjack and the bird. The perspective for the lumberjack allows the acting entity to chop the tree down, to assess its value in money, and to perhaps give it dimensions in terms of width, length, and height. Let's say those
Yeah.
are the functions that are available under the perspective of the lumberjack. Under the perspective of the bird, what you will see is an ability to nest, an ability to feed perhaps, an ability to fly off
Mhm.
and to the distance. Stuff like that it would do.
Now, why are you calling it perspectives? That is
Because
a subject, isn't it?
because at the moment we don't. They're just something that you could have if you were to adopt it. So now we have an acting entity that could adopt one of two perspectives. We've set up two perspectives. We've set up an entity.
Just one.
Right. Type-wise, we didn't set up an object. We then go and create an acting entity, but before we do that, we activate the subject of lumberjack. So we are now in our main function. We open up and activate the lumberjack perspective and create an acting entity object inside of it. Because of the active subject, we now know how this acting entity can behave, because it the functions to assess its value, to chop it down, and to measure its height, width, and length were made available from that perspective. And we've opened it up. And then we've closed it, and then we open up the bird perspective. So the tree is the same tree, up at the top. We create an object of tree.
Yeah.
We then move down and open up a perspective and create an acting entity within that perspective, which now assumes that perspective. And we do stuff to that tree. We then close off that perspective. The acting entity has disappeared with that, because it was only created inside of it.
And the tree's gone.
The tree is outside of it. The tree is reused.
But he chopped it.
If he chopped it. Well, see, this would actually change the reactions of the bird to say nest. It would be like error. You know what I mean?
That's a stump. Moving on.
Right. Whereas if, say, you switched around the two different perspectives and said bird first, it would have a fully blown tree, and only then it would get chopped. So, like,
Right.
your tree will change based on which subjects interacted with it as well, and how the tree is divvied up. And if you reopen the same perspective, it should technically have the exact same view of the tree as the last one left it.
So, why is perspective not subject? Why don't you just call
This
it?
is this is subject.
Oh, okay.
So I'm saying
It's like feels like you added a new word.
right.
for no
So
reason.
I'm saying you define two subjects for those two perspectives. So one subject is your lumberjack, one subject is your bird. So
Well,
a subject gives a perspective as a way to like think about it.
but
And the
you,
way
you wouldn't say the subject is the bird.
No.
You would say like that
So-
a bird nesting is a subject.
So this is why we had
Bird feeding is another subject, right?
So do you remember how I said what we had is like an active entity that has no meaning, and then in the subject we attach
Yeah.
all of those mechanisms to the active entity.
Yeah,
It's
that's
at
fine.
that point where you have not just an active entity, but a lumberjack active entity. So that attachment to the subject is what gave it that meaning. But outside of that meaning, you can't actually make sense out of what the acting entity can even do, because it's so. It's a layer of context way out. Like there's no specificity to the context, so it's like it's much like, well, if we don't speak about anything concrete, all of our abstract talking is just talking in circles, right? Like you have to make those connections, and at that point there is no connection, and
So, but
only
you're
through the
saying
activation of
it's
subjects.
acceptable to call a subject a bird because it's going to be unfolded later in the context anyways.
Right, because at this point we're not talking about identifying the type of object, but we're interested in knowing what it is, the manifestation of that type in that subject. And it's only because so an acting entity in the context of being a bird is this. Right?
Right.
A subject brings out the
And
context.
So what you want to be able to do, I guess, so we're mapping, in a way, mapping the environment and the various entities and objects and types and all that kind of stuff. And we want to do it in a way that says your subject can be a bird, but also we're loading up, like there is it, and it's the sun is in position for mating season or something like that, and like what you want to be able to just add things so that, hey, maybe like a nest can emerge out of that if you keep adding stuff, but it doesn't mean that that's what it was supposed to be in the beginning.
Right. And because each different subject is only responsible for a tiny small sliver of, tagging on functionality, right? The combination of tagged on functionality by the time you're dealing with your concrete objects is extremely narrow, right? So in every different context, there's only very tiny little things you can do with any given thing that you have.
I think we interneted again. I'm not sure if it completely died or not.
It's okay. Recording, right?
It is recording though. So this may drop frames. It's not bad. I guess it hiccuped. Is it still going? It thinks it's going.
So yeah, I just do want to make this point really, really, really solid here. By the time you get to like your most active subject,
we're still good, I think.
Right? By the time you get to the most active subject at any given real nuanced simulation, there's an extremely narrow range of aspects that is made available to you to do what these objects can do.
Yeah.
So, but they've been narrowed down so much that you only have this, and this action to do.
This reminds me of potentiality.
And everything else is taken almost care of by almost having like these intermediate aspects saying, okay, before you do that, do this. After you do this, do that.
Therefore, so you must do this before anything else is satisfied.
And you must only do this in this context. Nothing else can be done.
Yeah, so context. It's also like a project management Gantt chart style language, which is how reality works. Is a bunch of conditions that must be met for things to emerge. If the conditions aren't there, what do you get?
Right, and that's why it is the way it is, to be able to reason about it in concrete, understandable portions.
And now we're talking about organization of humans.
So the most complicated thing so far, past the idea of having a type and an object of that type, right, which duplicates the functionality across several objects, is you have the definition of subjects and the activation of subjects, which is similar. It's like instantiating a new object almost. So
pardon for the noise.
so in a way, a subject is like a kind of a special object that dictates how the other objects are supposed to operate while it's in place. It's like it's like your universe.
Right.
Or context.
And again, so I'm imagining, when you say the subject, I'm kind of imagining like a list or a script of things that need to be in place for this to be happening, whatever that subject is.
So, yes. The only thing I would add to your understanding to hopefully simplify it is that no matter what subject you're in, what you're left with is what objects you can play with. So once you've gone through the steps of creating your subject and activating your subject, you're back down into the same land of programming as you would with normal object-oriented programming. Because at that point, all you have is objects. All the subjects did is modify slightly what will happen when you give those objects messages. So it's actually kind of simple in that sense.
Not necessarily slightly, though.
But it's easier to reason about a piecemeal than it is to put a whole thing together. But the idea of, having your active entity, it can even be the same active entity. So imagine in your main program, you have your active entity object that doesn't have any functionality raw like that. Then you have your tree, which also has its function responses bound to whatever context it's in. Then you activate your lumberjack. You can use your active agent as only as a lumberjack. And then as soon as you switch a subject, it's as if it became the bird. So it's the same object, but it's just acting as a bird now. And that way you can change the behavior of a single object mid-program. So you can technically speaking shapeshift.
Well, because you're summarizing the interaction around the tree as an acting entity.
Yeah.
As if the tree doesn't really act on its own as in that sense.
Yeah. And an acting entity is anything arbitrary without an identity, so sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. But the program doesn't need to know the difference between this being a lumberjack, this being a bird. It can just keep track of what birds do, what lumberjacks do, and go through that through there. So that's like the long-winded, simplest explanation for subjects that you can possibly have. They're the most complex element.
Right. And so this kind of piques an interest to look at, again, the primordial archetypes, which I'm sure at some point we can. We don't have to now, but... And specifically like the offices, this stack of offices, and try to reason about what is happening in these different, let's say each object is a different subject, right, that someone can walk into. What does this actually look like? What does this office do? What does this office do?
So this is where this language starts to take a more specific role on top of the APS, because past this point that you're discussing right now, we need the domain language building facilities that can be built out of subjects, types, and aspects.
So we're not going to be dealing directly with that as a kind of a fundamentals.
We need to know that behind the scenes, that's all that's happening, but the way it's utilized in front of the scenes instead of behind the scenes is using a slightly more higher layer language that is built into the same language,
built out of the same.
Yeah. So once we establish what,
so we're talking about an emergent language, actually. So we're talking about multiple languages then.
No, it's one. It's all condensed into.
Oh yeah. No. Okay. So you were talking about the fact that it summarized these fundamental details into an upper sort of user-friendly section, which can then be dismantled and taken apart if you want to.
Yes. So now we're going to introduce context. We're going to introduce entity. We're going to introduce value, service, aggregate, all of these higher level. So, first thing to note is that when you're talking about something like an entity, it's like a type with extra features.
I'm kind of having a feeling here like we've jumped from like neural operating system to social operating system, in the way that now we seem to be talking about interactions amongst units.
Right,
in a sense.
And the reason is because we need the neural system to be able to chunk and work with the social system. So it needs to take pieces of it and process them through itself and put them back up. Right?
Right.
And to do that, we're introducing these.
So we should expect that.
We're introducing these new features that allow us to create languages to capture those upper layers. New languages out of the existing language. So we get into our entity, value, and aggregate, which are the simplest pieces to describe. So those are basically three different ways to think about what we already described as types. An entity is a type that no matter what the values of its attributes are, it always can be identified and referenced by a unique identifier set apart from those values. So like you can be referred to yourself as your driver's license or as your.
So it seems like an entity is just something that you want to track forever.
Something that has a life cycle. That's the key word, life cycle. So it has a birth, like a creation date, if you will. Like you would have a birthday, and then a cycle that it goes through that is specified by its own internal mechanisms, at the end of which it is potentially let go.
Terminated.
like a living database record.
Yeah, like, and this is like if you take on a role, it's kind of like you come up into this thing. The role is needed for some action to happen. The action is done. Why are you still in that role?
Right.
That's
in the same way that the subject deactivates, the entity disappears. Those are all very connected concepts. They work very similarly to each other. They're just responsible for different elements of that function.
I think I'm feeling a break.
So,
how about
okay,
you?
like 2
You want to
seconds.
sum up?
2 seconds then. So, we have 3 different ways to look at types. Services is like a potential subject plus aspect combination internally that can be applied to existing objects. So, for example, if you need an object to do something, you do it under the subject of the service, and then it does the execution.
You're saying
and it's
that
not part of the entity itself.
you slipped something in there, which might be interesting in that it seemed like you were saying in order to utilize a service externally, you have to model it internally. Is that to know what you're getting and how it's working? Is that,
So,
I thought I heard that kind of.
So you have like the full blown operation that you can do. You have the entities being responsible for manipulating themselves, and then you need some code to run as a result of these manipulations also that doesn't have anything intrinsic to do with the types that you have. So what you do is you bring in a service that has an aspect with the included operations that do not belong to any object, and by enabling that, by activating the subject, all of a sudden the service is
like a
scaffolding.
scaffolding.
Yeah, the service is available. But in the language, you don't start defining your subject to activate your aspect. You just say, I have a service. Service X. And then in your program, you'd be like, all right, service X, run this operation with these objects, hiding all those details away. So the way it looks to you is that you're just straightforwardly telling the program what to do, but the way it's actually doing is like also the APS way.
Ideally. So it's like, it seems like it's up to the recipient of who's doing the service to that their programming this is making sense. The objects you're putting into the service is congruent with the system and all that. And I'm imagining that if you don't have a proper model yourself to know whether what you're sending is correct or not,
it's going to be like
that there could be times where you could be deceived or like.
Well, ideally, the first thing that would happen is it would be like, you're trying to activate me. So the service will activate, and inside of it will have an aspect, and then that aspect will have what's called a concept. The concept is going to be like, you're trying to utilize me with this type. Does this type satisfy my requirements? No. You can't do this here. Right? So so there's like a safety involved in terms of like by the time when your subject is getting activated, the things it gets applied to must conform to some interface.
Ideally, that interface is known by both parties, even if
that's a contract. Yes, it's
even
called a
if
contract.
the role that's been spun up, the person doesn't understand how it works, what the system they're using should be telling them, no,
Yeah.
you're doing wrong.
It's the same way as like if you're trying to call a function that requires a string input with an integer. Either you convert that integer into a string of digits, or you find a different function to call. But anyway, you're making a mistake of breaking a contract that this function has made with you for you to be able to use it in the first place. The same thing applies to the subject. If you activate a subject that simply doesn't seem to belong, or if you try to do an operation in the wrong subject, it's also considered your error. It's your programmer error.
Cool. Shall we?
Yeah.
For a short break, we'll be right back. Oh, yes.
All right. So
Breadcrumbs.
to summarize my last summary,
Sure.
what we're trying to get to is this. The APS, raw APS, stops its linguistic development at the mark of these primitives, let's call them that, concept, type, subject, aspect. So that's the
fundamental. I prefer.
Yeah.
I prefer
like
fundamental.
it's the most generic programming language it's dealing with. So everything can happen through that.
It's for primates.
The other side of it is that that's not the part of the language that's being utilized by this developed programming language that we're trying to get to. And the reason being is that even though that's the gist of how it operates, there's specific patterns, and we are mostly interested in the pattern that allows us to develop domain-specific languages. So that no matter what language is being spoken, there's a translation layer to those fundamentals. That's the key.
Right.
So even if the expression is completely out there, it's still just that.
It sounds like you're just talking about emergence of an extension language in which to describe what we're seeing.
To make use of it beyond its raw form. A useful use of it. Specific one to language creation.
Right.
And this language creation to a translation layer to all languages.
And this again kind of
the polymorphic machine
reminds me of jumping from like mimetic to abstract, in that now you're making soundbite codes for doing something rather than describing the archetypes.
Exactly. You're getting it. So it becomes a little bit more concrete, in another way a little bit more abstract in some sense, because now you have like a higher level of abstraction in itself. So
right.
So we started the discussion with saying you take that type idea and this idea of, say, value, the idea of entity, and just look at them as a pattern of how to implement a type. So with IDs having their unique identifier being the thing that allows them to be identified, with the value, it's intrinsic value that allows it to be called the same across different places. We've discussed how the difference between, say, you the person versus the number 5. So like it doesn't matter if I create the number 5 now or later, it's still the same number. So its disappearance out of existence and reappearance into existence has nothing to do with it being it. But once an entity disappears, no other entity can be that entity. Right? It's only that one entity. It's like it's unique across the entire system. So that's the difference between the two. Still types, which makes them play on the same level, on the same playing field. But very different ways to reason about their intrinsic nature, so to speak.
Right. Go over the list again of at this higher layer of language.
So,
because you're saying value, that's one of them.
Yes.
Right. Entity.
Entity, value.
Aggregate.
Aggregate is a special kind of entity. It creates a border.
And this is the subjectivity kind of collection.
It's not subjective in this case, but it creates a kind of natural boundary between the entities that it's aggregated inside of it and the way the outside world can communicate with them. So it provides the interface on the whole as to how to manage this group of entities together.
Okay. Okay, I guess I must have misremembered about, you were talking about like the mountain range and subjectivity stacking. That's where I thought aggregates were coming out of, but you're talking about entities.
No, this is at the peak still. So,
and we haven't brought up aggregates yet, so
yeah, but
A
aggregates,
while ago I heard it.
I add this to the simple list because aggregates are entities. They just have a special unique role in creating an interface boundary between the...
So it's like a corporation.
Right.
Basically.
It's like you can't talk to the employee inside of the corporation if you're not going through a specific extension telephone channel that is specifically designed to reach that operator, but not because you want to talk to them, but because you have a specific question to the company.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's
and
that.
You called the company's number.
Exactly.
The single main number, and then a sub extension.
Yes. It's going through that formal route. So the aggregate provides those formal routes to adjust what's happening in the entities it's aggregating. So it's the thing that's responsible for switching their values.
And this must be included because this is how you're kind of having sort of extra layers of complexity, like complexity building, stacking, if you will. You need that ability to take the unit and cluster units together into a higher unit, so to speak, right? And
so I've been using this word kind of interchangeably with subject, but then you have what's called context. That's the higher level subject, basically. The context is what tells you, for example, where the boundaries of the aggregates would be. So this is what would change in different aggregates Like, if you have an aggregate in this context, it only has these operations and touches only those elements. If it's in this context, it has a different role to play, and it does that instead. So a user in the context of, say, speaking in a chat versus a user moderating the chat itself and having the permissions to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, it does sound very similar to subject.
Well, much like entity is exactly like a type but with extras. Context would be a subject with extras.
What are the extras?
Contexts.
Why not just call it a subject?
Contexts need to be able to translate between each other. So what's called a context map. So the meaning of an entity in one context provides a description of this meaning to another context. So
I think again we're rising up to the social from the neural to the
yeah,
social.
it's trying to bridge them.
It's like
trying to bridge them under one language.
Mm-hmm.
It is that. I forget, like, there's more to context than just that, but like in general they are the delimiters of, like, when in one context the word user means this, and so the domain language is oriented that way. You can have the same word user appear here, but it'll be oriented in a different way. So in a authentication context, a user has password, a user has credentials, a user has this, that, and the other thing. In the sales context, for example, a user has an opportunity to make a sale, and they're going through the motions of the oceans to get a contract going, and they're in that state of the process.
Again, it feels almost indistinguishable from subject, except for the fact that we're in a social context.
Well, two contexts live...
Social setting.
Contexts live side by side. Always. So it's going to be the same user with the credentials over here that having those credentials can access the system over here.
Okay.
But treated a completely different way.
So once again, it sounds like you're having this ability to wrap multiple subjects all together into something, and then have their... So
right.
Again, it's like an organization of something bigger, emergent, and then describing the inner subjectivities, subjects of that.
Right, and you wouldn't want to do it with raw subjects because it's a lot of boilerplate. Whereas context already assumes these things and can build shit for you.
It's almost like just slapping a name, a title, a shared understanding of that we are now incorporated. This is the corporation, and these are the different contexts within the corporation.
And then the other thing that the context is responsible for providing is like, okay, I'm in the sales context, and I need the user. Can you please pass me over which user I'm working with? Mm-hmm. So it was going to be a responsibility from this context to that context to map what it knows to be the user to what it knows to be the user. It's going to be the same user. So it's like cross-subject communication. So that's where it's different than raw subjects, in that in raw subjects you'd have to build it out all yourself. Here, you'll get the opportunity to connect, to create these maps.
So you have like a key ID in your database table type of thing that's could be shared across.
It could be like, grab your user data based on this external key ID that I have for my user